We left off with the vagus, and this is the cranial nerve that doesn't only innervate or supply information to the head and neck. So this travels far afield, distal organs. We get information from and then control of organs in the visceral region, in the thorax, heart, lungs, liver, intestines, stomach, not just head and neck. So vagus is both some say merry money, but my brother says big brains. This one's brains. Both, motor and sensory. The sensory aspect, like glossopharyngeal, relays information from these mysterious bodies, the carotid bodies and the aortic bodies. Tough Friday so far. Information on blood pressure and oxygenation of the blood. And it might be redundancy, which is really important, especially when those variables are critically important to life. Blood pressure and oxygen. So we get two signals, glossopharyngeal and now vagus, giving that information back to the brain. And we also get information on hunger, pain, distension and bloating from the intestines, feelings of hunger from those the microbiome, from bacteria that are telling you to eat pizza and junk food when they're lacking that kind of nutrients in the surrounding. Fullness, pain, etc. All those are complemented by motor action on the parasympathetic side to those same regions. So you don't have voluntary control over your heart, over your digestion. Not voluntary control in the sense that when I called your name out or pointed at you, your heart might have skipped a beat and you felt stressed. That felt voluntary. That's not voluntary. The lung, the epithelium there, the proximal part of the large intestine, all of this is innervated by the vagus nerve. So control here of secretions and helping to absorb nutrients from the food we eat, contractions of the intestines, peristalsis as it's called, to push food along. All that regulated by the vagus nerve. Second last was accessory. One that we often forget, very small nerve, not the smallest, but has a very minimal function. Only motor, matter more. Second last is matter. Only motor activation of the accessory nerve, and specifically of muscles that position the head in space. Neck muscles that maintain posture and orientation of the head. Now you can see the muscles on here. The names of the muscles aren't important yet. Trapezius is one that you've probably heard before. Sternocleidomastoid, not so much. So that's a great example of where the names of muscles describe origins and insertions, describe their connection points, part of their function. We'll get to those as we move into that section after we finish and round out the nervous system. Motor action here, forgot to bring this up, but control of the head and neck. Controlling the position of the head in space. This is a cranial nerve, even though it looks kind of like there are roots coming from the spinal column. This used to be called the spinal accessory nerve. But the more correct and current version interpretation is this is just accessory, part of the cranial nerves. Last nerve, hypoglossal, below the tongue, hypoglossal, is also motor. The H in ah, or if you want to really exclaim, you could say, ah, heaven. H, hypoglossal, below the tongue. Motor activation here is to control the tongue, muscles of speaking, and partial control of the muscles of swallowing as well. roots from the medulla, fairly obvious, that control the sublingual region. There is more information than we've presented on these nerves to go over in Wiley Plus, for instance. There will be some detailed questions for 2 or 3 of the nerves in the new adaptive practice. I turned off the detailed questions for the majority of them, but the ones that I think are important will have a bit more detailed information. Some of the information will be on the passage of the nerve, which we've not covered at all. I think we need to wait until we talk about the bones of the skull before we can really talk about passage of the nerve. There might be some questions like that, but you'll get to know it really well, or them really well. The 3 that I've left some detailed questions on. And what are those 3? Those 3, I think, are olfactory, optic, and trigeminal. Big ones that we've referred to a few times. We've emphasized the branching on the functions of. And they're pretty obvious nerves. They're easy to spot. But there's a lot more information than we're covering right now in class. This is the level I expect you to know for the rest of them. So questions about the cranial nerves before we move on? No? Okay. So we move down. We're moving inferior, further away from the brain, into the spinal cord, which is again part of lab this week. What's nice about this section is that there are a number of familiar faces, common terms, common names. It's not brand new rocket science. And we've already highlighted some of the main functions of the spinal cord. But other than those main functions, the spinal cord helps to process reflexes, which is the item at the end of the outline that I thought may or may not be included in this section. And it probably will next Tuesday. Helps to process reflexes. We don't know what that means yet, but we'll see their quick automatic responses. It also helps to integrate these complex words: excitatory postsynaptic potentials or inhibitory postsynaptic potentials, IPSPs or EPSPs. And I don't expect they'll make a lot of sense to you right now. They will make much more sense when we talk about action potentials and signal conduction next week. These are stimuli to activate or inhibit structures innervated by a nerve, or activate or inhibit the activity of the nerve. I was going to say turn up or turn down, but you don't really turn down on the inhibitory side, and we'll see that coming up. Or depending on your interpretation, you might think, yeah, turn down. That will be clear when we get into the signal transduction section. And then, of course, like we would expect, conducts impulses, signals between the brain and the rest of the body. That's the classic example that we've already talked about. Sensory impulses to the brain so it can make a plan and then act by increasing secretions or activating muscles, what have you. So let's talk about the anatomy of the spinal cord before we get into pathways of signal transduction and the reflexes. We'll talk about the anatomy as far as the overall setup of the cord, then we'll focus on nerves specifically. We'll probably stop with our discussion of spinal nerves, and then we'll leave the reflexes and some of the more complex arrangements for next Tuesday. So familiar faces, as shown here. Layers of protection of the spinal cord. It's like deja vu for the brain. All the meninges that we talked about are still here and intact. Same order, same characteristics, from superficial to deep, dura, arachnoid, pia. Cerebrospinal fluid still lives in the subarachnoid space, still surrounds the spinal cord and helps to float the spinal cord. And you can see those layers folded away here on the inset picture. Dura, of course, the toughest outermost layer, shown here. Arachnoid, pia. What's different is that we have these ligaments that are little buds, little projections of the pia mater that anchor the spinal cord in place, called the denticulate ligaments. Helps to keep it positioned within the spinal column. And we can't see them here, but intimately related to these nerves and these meninges are the bones, the vertebrae of the spinal column, which are not something we're going into now, but I want you to picture where they would be. There would be one bone between each set of spinal nerves. And that's how we think about the nerves. There are pairs of spinal nerves coming off of each side, and the vertebrae would sit between those, allowing passage between them. So a bit more of a detailed picture here, which is a really nice comprehensive road map of the spine, the plexuses, the braided networks that arise from the spinal nerves, and then the nerves as they travel out to the body. That's coming up. And while we were thinking of vertebrae, you can also see the hierarchical arrangement here of the nerves within the spinal column. So just briefly, there are four main types of bones in the vertebral column: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. You can argue there's coccygeal as well. But the nerves are named according to the level and in the region where they arise. C1 through C8 are arising around this cervical vertebrae. T1 through T12 arise from between thoracic vertebrae, and so on. So it's important, I think, to understand that before we move forward. We name them based on the arrangement or the point of origination of these nerves. The cord itself is this contiguous, solid yellow bit in the middle. It starts right away at the start of the cervical vertebrae number 1 and ends just at the superior border of L2. L2. Even though it looks like there are projections further down, and there are, the spinal cord by name ends at L2. The nerves continue in an arrangement that we call the cauda equina, which means horse's tail, because it looks like a horse's tail. The cauda equina. So we still have nerves from the spinal cord traveling inferior in the body that escape the vertebral column or the pelvis down here, but they're not part of the spinal cord itself. Cauda equina. And the entire process is anchored all the way down at the coccyx, the most distal or inferior part of the spinal column, by the filum terminale. The filum terminale, which is simply an extension of all of the meninges that fuse together and connect at the coccyx. Dura, arachnoid, pia fuse together into the filum terminale and anchor the spinal cord at the base. So you see all the names of the nerves. You see that there are plexuses nearby. We'll talk about those coming up. What other defining characteristics can we see? We can see some bulges. Normally the spinal cord seems to be a column, but there are two distinct bulges or enlargements. The cervical enlargement in the cervical area, the lumbar enlargement bordering the lumbar area, and the enlargements are where nerves that travel out to the limbs originate. So a nice defining feature to anchor yourself in space. Generally, other than at the very base of the spinal cord, generally innervation kind of sits at the same level as where the nerves bud off of the spinal cord or leave the spinal cord. So if we take a section, let's take a section and move forward with that idea. If we take a section through the spinal cord here, we can see a few other characteristics that help orientate it in space for us. We can see a pair of spinal nerves on what I'd call the right and the left, but it's kind of oblique. This is a spinal nerve here, that's a spinal nerve there. Together they are one pair. The spinal cord, you'll notice, has a roughly circular shape. It's kind of flattened, a bit more oval. And the easiest way, there's two real easy ways to tell which way you're looking at it. One, I like to look at the median fissure down here. There's a nice little split on the anterior side that helps orient the spinal column in space. Or the gray matter, the shape of the gray matter, when you get used to looking at it, looks heavier, rounder, more robust on the anterior portion. That's how you can orient yourself in space. So the spinal cord gives rise to nerves via first rootlets. Rootlets, either on the back or on the front. The connection of nerves to the spinal cord is in the form of rootlets, very small roots. The rootlets combine to form roots, and the roots combine to form nerves. Rootlets, roots, and nerves. And this is consistent throughout. This is the arrangement for nervous attachment to the spinal column. And the lab manual does a great job helping you identify which is which. There are sensory and motor rootlets, sensory and motor roots. Which side is which? You think amps, so anterior is motor, posterior is sensory. This holds up throughout the spinal column. Or if your name is Dave, this is a gimme. You can think of dorsal as an afferent nerve, ventral as an efferent nerve. Easy ways to remember which direction the signals are traveling. In through the back, out through the front. The sensory nerves returning to the spinal column, their cell bodies, the neuronal bodies, lie outside of the spinal column. So you can also use this as a defining feature to orient a section of the spinal column in space. The roots on the back have these bulges where the cell bodies lie. They're called ganglia. They're obvious. They're obvious enlargements where the sensory nerve cell bodies lie. Those are always posterior. We can also see another interesting aspect considering what we've talked about so far. The central canal is just a projection of the fourth ventricle from way up in the brain. Cerebrospinal fluid projects all the way down and through the spinal column. Very small, but there is a canal that goes all the way through. Now the pattern, the distribution of nerves, the gray matter and the white matter is pretty distinct and obvious. See this butterfly or H-shaped pattern, which looks a lot nicer on this electron micrograph slide. Not electron micrograph. Microscopy slide. I think that's the word I want. Notice the anterior fissure to help orient you. If we didn't have these labels, anterior versus posterior, you could easily figure out which side is which. We don't have nerves to tell where the ganglia are, but this is fairly easy to orient ourselves in space. Gray matter interior this time, unlike the brain where gray matter was the surface, the majority of the surface, and white matter was the interior tracts. Here the orientation is flipped. And the gray matter is arranged as horns. They're called horns. Horns of the H or horns of the butterfly, depending on how creative you want to be. So the posterior gray horn, always sensory and typically smaller. Cell bodies that connect to the neurons there lie outside the spinal cord. but the anterior gray horn larger because the neuronal cell bodies lie within the gray matter where the synapses occur to take motor signals to the periphery. Generally a larger bulge on the anterior side. And those are the two main horns, but it is worth mentioning that there are lateral horns in the thoracic region only. Lateral horns in the thoracic region only. And the lateral horns are specifically tasked with autonomic motor outputs. Involuntary motor outputs to things like the lungs and the heart, glands in that area. The anterior horns are somatic motor output, so you have voluntary control, signals leaving the anterior horns. Lateral horns are for autonomic control or autonomic motor output. And we'll come back to looking at the white matter, but there are general divisions. There's posterior, anterior, and lateral, what we call columns. And they're columns because that's largely the direction that the information is being sent along the nerves within those tracts. We'll come back to talk about that when we talk about the reflexes shortly. So if we were to follow nervous impulses in general terms, as a brief overview, how might signals be transmitted through the spinal cord? Now you can follow these numbers in detail, and there's a great write-up in the book to do just that. There has to be some stimulus. Sensory nerves have to be activated in response to something. And that signal is carried along afferent nerves to the posterior roots. And once we enter the spinal cord, there are three possible outcomes. Option one, that signal is sent directly to the brain. Maybe the axons of those nerves don't enter the gray matter to synapse with other nerves. We'll talk about that in a second. Maybe they go right into the white matter to the brain. That's option one. Option two, that signal can synapse with what we call an interneuron, which then leaves the white matter to travel to the brain, sends the signal to the higher order thinking areas of the brain. Or option three, which is the basis of a reflex, that signal can be transmitted directly to an interneuron within the gray matter that connects to a motor neuron in the anterior horn and sends an immediate motor output to, for instance, skeletal muscle. A direct motor reflex via the intervening interneuron or intermediate neuron. Which is the basis for reflexes. And we'll talk about a few different types of reflexes, specific types that you'll often see with in exercise physiology, or when you talk about personal training and fitness, or the classic reflex, the hammer on the tibial tendon, where you kick your knee when you're at the doctor's office. We'll talk about those in detail, about what kinds of signals are being transmitted. But this is the basis for a reflex, that third option where the signal is relayed directly to the muscle without going to the brain for processing. So just brief terms right now, this we'll come back to. In the meantime, if we're moving out from the spinal cord, we have an understanding of the layers that protect this and the orientation of the tissues within the spinal cord. Let's talk about now the nerves. Let's talk about the nerves in the spinal cord. This is an obvious difference, I think, between the spinal cord and the brain, other than shape and purpose. The nerves arising here are ordered in pairs and serve specific functions. So I think it goes without saying, the nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system, as we've already identified. And they do the work. They execute the plan sent by the brain through the spinal cord. All told, there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves in the configuration we're going to look at today. And the configuration holds up for all 31 pairs. All of them, like we talked about, have anterior and posterior roots. With their corresponding motor and sensory signals being sent. Now you can see a cross-section of the nerve shown here. So nerve would be a bundle of multiple fascicles. And a fascicle is a bundle of multiple axons. So individual nerve fibers packaged together, and then those packages grouped in one nerve. And so we take a look at one of the nerves leaving the spinal column. You can peel it back, a lot like the layers of an onion, or if you've seen the fibers in a muscle in passing, maybe in biology. Much a similar arrangement to the multiple layers of a muscle fiber. These fascicles generally are grouped by function, so signals going to or coming from a certain area are usually grouped within a fascicle. They're often mixed. They're almost exclusively always mixed. There are sensory and motor axons running within each fascicle, carrying information to and from specific areas in the body. These then split and return via the dorsal roots, or supply via the anterior roots to go out to the muscles. So there are multiple layers of protection. The immediate closest layer, around each axon, we have what we call the endoneurium. Around the fascicles is the perineurium, around the fascicle. And the epineurium, the largest, most robust outer sheath, is a projection of the duramater. It's a projection of the outer meninge, the main meninge of the spinal cord that protects the nerve as it travels to the periphery. Now, all of these are typically made of fibroblasts and collagen, so it's generally a tough exterior. And the thickness increases as you move superficial. So the thickness is, or they're thin rather, when they wrap around each individual axon, of moderate thickness around a fascicle, and the thickest, most protective layer around the entire nerve. So this is the combined, all of the nerves leaving or heading to the spinal cord. These are the nerves that are immediately budding off of the spinal cord. But as soon as they leave, they split. So this is where we see them immediately before the split. You can see the section up here on the inset figure. Shortly thereafter, the nerves split into what we call rami, or branches. Anterior and posterior rami. So we're looking down. This is a superficial view of the spinal cord. You can see the spinal cord here. You can see a vertebrae here. The muscles, the deep back muscles that protect and articulate movements of the vertebral column, shown at the back or the top of the slide. And the nerve that we just looked at would have been a branch right around where these thick portions are, just before the split on either side. And the split is into posterior and anterior rami. One ramus, two rami. posterior and anterior branches. And they're highlighted both blue and red because they contain both sensory and motor information. Part of the reason that the roots need to combine is for this to happen, so that sensory and motor innervation or information can be carried along one nerve. The posterior branch is generally smaller and has an equally small role. Well, I won't say small. No role is small. But it typically will only innervate the muscles, the deep back muscles, as shown here. The branches project into these muscles, whatever they happen to be called. And then also supply the skin along the back, providing somatic sensory information about the skin along the back. And typically, the innervation is always at the level or near the level where they leave the spinal column. So if you have a superior pair of spinal nerves, the posterior rami typically innervate the muscles at that level and the skin at that level as well. They don't travel very far. Something similar can be said for the anterior rami. They generally stay at that same level, but they do everything else. They innervate muscles of the limbs, glands in the thoracic cavity, the skin of the anterior and lateral surfaces, most of the body. But this is predictable. So if you believe that they innervate... You have a question? Okay. Question?
No.
Stretching, gotcha. It's an exciting lecture, I get it. These are predictable. Much like the spinal column is organized, we can observe, or we can map the somatic senses of those spinal nerves here in what we call dermatomes. These are areas of the skin that supply somatic information to specific nerves. And these are mapped again according to the level of the spinal nerves: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral. There's generally very little overlap between these sections. There's some small overlap. This is useful in diagnostic terms to figure out if there's any damage and at what level of the spinal cord there might be damage. If you can't feel sensations in a certain area of the body, we can map that area to part of the spinal column. So this is the somatic sensory information. The motor information is not as clean and packaged. Muscles don't lie at specific horizontal slices. And so the motor information is a bit more complex and a topic for a later section of the course. Even the idea that rootlets merge to form roots, that roots combine to form nerves, and then they branch, is simplistic. It seems complicated and convoluted, I know. But the reality is there's another layer on top of that for most of the spinal column, not all. And that is that these the nerves will combine into what we call plexuses. They braid together to form plexuses in everywhere but the thoracic region. The thoracic region is typically more organized than the rest of the body. Their muscles do kind of line up in horizontal slices along the ribs. There isn't a need for this repackaging of information, but in the cervical regions, in the lumbar regions, we have to organize these nerves to be sent to the arms, the legs, specific muscles in the lower leg, the foot. And so these plexuses help us do that, help us repackage that information. So the anterior rami specifically form these braids, or form these networks. This helps to ensure that we have both sensory and motor information going to very targeted, specific areas. I also kind of like to think of it as another layer of support, because the braiding, the meshwork of these plexuses is probably a bit more durable than just single nerve fibers heading out to do a job. There's not likely to be a lot of torque or torsion or force on the nerves, but I like to think of it as providing an extra layer of stability as well. So we have sensory and motor fibers combined. And then after all of this nonsense with the plexuses is done, you'll often see the common names of nerves that you've heard before that typically identify what structure they're innervating, what region they're going to, or what their function is. There are technically 5 plexuses that arise from the spinal column. We are going to look at one in detail, and we will be introduced to 2 more, but we're not really going to talk at length about the last 2, because these are fairly complicated structures. Sigh of relief. You thought the cranial nerves were bad. The plexus that we're going to discuss at length is the brachial plexus. This is a fairly common plexus to emphasize in anatomy and physiology. It's one of my favorite plexuses because it's the one that I always damage whenever I dislocate my shoulders. I've dislocated each one once, separated this one twice, and this one another time. So I always like to think about what damage I'm doing to my nerves when that happens as I sit on the ground after taking a dive off my mountain bike, trying to put my shoulder back in, or playing hockey. I think what I'm going to do is actually just break here. This is a complicated topic. There's a lot of stuff to talk about. I'm not even going to show you what the plexus looks like. It's in your notes, but we're going to pick up fresh on Tuesday with this discussion. A little bit of a break. Happy Friday. Don't get used to it.